Rupert Jones is a retired British Army Major General. He was a commanding officer of British troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Also, he served as a Joint Force Commander. Welcome to the program, General Jones.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be with you.
Bloomberg reported that Vladimir Putin was running out of time to achieve any kind of breakthrough in Ukraine. Do you also feel that?
Yeah, I think so. 2024 felt like it was going to be a year that was challenging for Ukraine at a strategic level. I absolutely recognize the day-to-day challenges you and all of Ukraine faces, but at a strategic level, it felt as though 2024 was going to be a very difficult year for Ukraine. It felt as though Russia was building a little bit of momentum, and you know there were some gloomy commentators. I'm sure in Ukraine, but internationally. Here we are halfway through the year, and it doesn't feel as though President Putin and Russian forces have managed to take advantage of that opportunity. Their much vaunted attack north of Kharkiv a month ago now hasn't really delivered the results I think they hoped for. In fact, it definitely hasn't delivered the results they hoped for. So does it feel as though time is slipping away from them? Yes, a little bit, because as I'm sure we're going to come on to, the clock is building back up again for Ukraine after the disappointments of 2023, when Western nations did not help you by delaying the provision of equipment so long. Hopefully the aid packages from European nations, but of course particularly from the United States, are coming early enough to allow the Ukraine military to absorb them and turn them into real capability for their next big steps.
Bloomberg experts are confident that a window for Russia's breakthrough is narrowing as Ukraine continues to receive weapons from the United States and Europe. Do you think that Russia has failed to exploit its previous advantages?
Yeah, I think so. You know, we can't predict the future, but the battlefield felt ripe for Russian exploitation coming into this spring and summer, but they haven't achieved anything significant. As I say, the attack north of Kharkiv has delivered very little. You know, minor gains, single digits of kilometers. And they've taken those at very significant loss, as with all their operations last year. So it doesn't feel as though they're making significant gains. Significant gains are, you know, on the sort of scale that Ukraine secured in late 2022. The Russians have not managed that. Indeed, as I understand it, latest reporting is that Ukrainian forces have started pushing the Russians back again on that front. And critically, you know, the reason for opening up that front in the north was to pull Ukrainian forces in multiple directions. That's what you do. You attack an enemy in one place and get him looking there, and then you attack elsewhere. The Russians have not managed to do that. Throughout this campaign of the last 2+ years, they have consistently displayed an inability to orchestrate the full concert of war in time and space, and their attack in the north of Kharkiv demonstrates their inability to do that once again.
From your perspective, how such failures, Russia's failures in the Kharkiv region, can influence their calculus and influence their capabilities in short and long-term perspective?
Well, you know, they've committed quite a lot of the early summer period to their efforts north of Kharkiv, and it, you know, we should, and forgive me speaking to a Ukrainian audience, because you will know this far better than we sitting in Britain and elsewhere. Russia has an extraordinary ability to absorb losses. They demonstrated that clearly throughout the Second World War. They've demonstrated that through the war in their legal invasion of Ukraine. suffering enormous losses, but we should be cautious of any thinking that says that means that they're running out of steam. It is frankly extraordinary. They can absorb the losses that they're absorbing, but they do appear able to. So any judgments based on the scale of Russian human loss would seem mistaken. So what do I think will happen in the short to medium term from a Russian perspective? I think they will continue to bludgeon in the way they are on their current axes. But your forces have continued to demonstrate an incredible ability to absorb those bludgeoning attacks. And at some stage, those attacks, the Russian attacks, will just begin to whimper out. They'll lose momentum. And I clearly have no insight as to the Ukrainian General Staff's next moves. The one thing I am confident of is that President Zelensky and his generals are coming up with that next move when they're ready and when they're satisfied they've integrated enough of the new equipment, the new capability that is coming from international donors.
Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Army, General Syrsky, said that Ukraine could use this opportunity in its failure. I mean, this failed Russia's offensive in the Kharkiv region. How it is possible for Ukraine to turn the tide in its favor?
Yeah, I mean, my sense has been that Ukrainian forces have been very sensible so far in 2024, and again, I apologize if that sounds patronizing. I certainly don't mean it to be. I mean it with the greatest respect. After the challenging 2023, where the gains by Ukraine did not meet expectations, certainly some Western commentators were overstating the likelihood of major Ukrainian gains in 2023. But it always felt to me as though 2024 therefore needed to be a year of consolidation, to bring on board international equipment, properly integrate it into capability, and not rush it into battle. And to do that, it meant you had to be able to absorb Russian thrusts through 2024. And withstand international pressure to act precipitously. And it seems to me that Ukraine military have done that very effectively so far. I'm sure at great cost, at great suffering, and at great pain, but have held their nerve and have held the line. And the question will then be for the Commander-in-Chief and for President Zelensky is where to then exploit when they feel the situation is right. I, for one, have always sought to avoid speculating on where Ukraine might mount attacks for two reasons. First, I think it's unhelpful to commit the intellect of previous military commanders from the West to point Ukraine in one particular direction or another, not least because it's actually offering insight to Russia. But secondly, because we have no information. We don't have the intelligence, we don't have the detailed analysis that sits inside the Ukraine government and the Ukraine Ministry of Defense. And therefore, it's for me, a bit of a fool's game for commentators to second guess where those assaults might come.
Also, Business Insider reported that Ukraine was preparing ground for attacking Crimea by F-16 jets. Ukrainian army has been destroying Russia's anti-aircraft systems in Crimea to prepare some ground. How do you see this perspective for attacking, to putting more pressure on Crimea with new F-16 jets?
Yeah, there's no doubt. There's been a lot of talk, hasn't there, about F-16s for a considerable period of time, and no single capability will turn the war for Ukraine, or indeed for the Russians. And so the much vaunted provision of Western tanks, for sake of argument, long-range attack missiles, air defense, now F-16s, all these add to Ukrainian capability, add to your arsenal, but they are not in and of themselves, the game changer. But there is no doubt that when F-16s start to take to the air, properly integrated with other air capability and with air defense and synchronized with ground forces, the F-16s will or should make a significant difference to Ukraine's ability to strike Russia. I'm sure that the Ukrainian armed forces want to be cautious with the use of those F-16s. They'll look like high-price assets. Losing them will hand propaganda opportunity to the Russians, quite apart from the loss of an aircraft and potentially pilots. So I'm sure they'll want to use them carefully, but I'm sure they will also want to make a demonstration of them. So President Zelensky is a very, very fine communicator, and I'm sure he will want his armed forces to use those F-16s to make a point, both to Western allies, but critically to President Putin and indeed to the Ukrainian people.
The United States has allowed Ukraine to strike inside Russia, but only near the Kharkiv region. Also, France and the United Kingdom have already allowed Ukraine to conduct some strikes inside Russia. From your perspective, can this permission from the West to strike inside Russia turn the tide into Ukraine's favor?
Well, I mean, I sort of referred to my earlier comment that no single thing can turn the tide. But is it helpful to Ukraine that some of the leading donor nations, including the United States and the United Kingdom, are now permitting their capability to be used to strike into Russian territory? Undoubtedly. I would actually put it the other way. It was extraordinary that we were providing capability to to Ukraine, and placing caveats of that type on its use, because Russia, President Putin, faces no such caveats. He strikes you from wherever he wishes into your sovereign territory, and therefore the idea that you're not able to strike military targets that are inside Russia, that are about to pose a significant threat to Ukraine, is extraordinary, either because they are forming up forces inside Russia, or indeed because there's logistic and strategic targets deeper into Russia. So it is good news. It's good news because it's a further demonstration of unity and support by the international community for the government of Ukraine. It is also good news because it helps release one hand from behind Ukraine's back, and that has to be a positive for your war effort.
Do you support lifting another restrictions on Ukraine's strikes inside Russia, which are still in place?
Yeah, I mean, I would. I mean, I think it is unreasonable to expect is complete, unfettered, unrestricted use of Western donored equipment to President Zelensky. This is about a dialogue. It's about a partnership, and so I would fully expect governments who are donating equipment to have a conversation with Zelensky and with your generals about what is appropriate and not appropriate use of those assets. It seems to me that is entirely reasonable. Will we wish to be seeing, for instance, use of Western equipment to strike? I'm not suggesting this for a moment, but strike into the heart of Moscow. Well, that would seem not to be sensible. So, between that and no use of our weapons striking into Russia, there is a sweet spot.
Why is the West so afraid of long-range strikes inside Russia? I mean, not on Moscow, on Kremlin, but on legitimate military targets inside Russia.
Well, I mean, I suppose it plays to the the caution that Western leaders have demonstrated ever since the original invasion, or the second invasion in 2022. And that is that Western leaders are trying to strike a balance where they give their full support to President Zelensky and to the Ukrainian people without inadvertently causing an escalation in the conflict. And you know better than me, in the early months of the war, you know, Western leaders, NATO leaders spent hours and hours and days discussing what level of support to provide without inadvertently causing escalation of the war into elsewhere in Europe that is in nobody's interests. And you will recall that President Putin was making various nuclear threats. Now, for me, those threats always rang untrue. President Putin is an opportunist, and it never felt to me as though there was an opportunity to use nuclear weapons. But Western leaders had to take those threats seriously, certainly initially. Now, increasingly, we know that there's absolutely no substance behind those threats, and we should continue to listen when President Putin makes those sorts of threats, and use our intelligence very carefully to make sure that we pick up any warning signs that they are going to use them. But I think increasingly there's no substance, and Western leaders should be increasingly confident that Russia won't use nuclear weapons, which is of course why they have been providing more and more capability to Ukraine. But I guess to the heart of your question remains a nervousness by some Western leaders about where is there a red line? You know, if we as a nation provide a level of support to Ukraine, will that cross some kind of threshold for President Putin? I don't think there is a threshold, not a credible threshold, certainly not around using long-range fires to strike legitimate military targets inside Russia. But I think that sits at the heart of why some Western politicians remain nervous.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin says that he would order a ceasefire in Ukraine if Ukraine withdrew from Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk and Donetsk regions. Why does Putin want a ceasefire right now?
Well, I'm not sure he does want a ceasefire. He's playing politics, and regrettably, he's a past master at it. He's a master of disinformation and of lying, but also of manipulating parts of the world population. So he I don't believe necessarily does want a ceasefire, but what he does want to do is try and shape the conversation. So, you know, just as, you know, the G7 have been meeting, just as President Zelensky has had his peace summit, he wants to try and seize the narrative and go, hey, look, you know, the war could stop tomorrow. You know, I'm happy to negotiate. I'm happy to have a ceasefire. And of course, what he's trying to do is to influence certain parts of the globe, whether you can pick your parts of the globe as to those who are in Russia's camp or those who are in Russia's influence and feel unable to stand up for Ukraine because they're somehow fettered by Russia. He is trying to speak to those nations who will swallow much of his narrative and then echo what he says and say, look, you know, President Putin is happy to have a ceasefire. It's Ukraine that are prolonging the war. He's trying to trigger that sort of narrative, that sort of conversation. And as you very well know, you know, his proposal was nothing short of farcical. Nobody in their right mind, least of all President Zelensky, was going to accept any kind of ceasefire on that basis. And of course, it has indeed been ridiculed, if that's the right word, by international leaders and international organizations for what it is. It's not a ceasefire proposal at all.
What is your take on the Global Peace Summit organized by Ukraine, and do you believe that the West can force Russia to make any kind of concessions to Ukraine?
Well, I think it's interesting. You know, we're just kind of beginning to hear the final conclusions at the peace summit. I absolutely applaud President Zelensky for leading that summit, because I think it's important that we start to have these conversations. There was no expectation, was there, that a peace summit now would lead to peace. But what it is starting to do is to set the agenda, create a conversation, create unity, work through some of the issues at this early stage. And the fact that some world leaders weren't there, the fact that China wasn't there, the fact that not all nations signed the communique, to be honest, is just noise. What matters is that there was a peace summit and the international community was engaged with it and were supportive of it, and critically that they continue to uphold the standards of international law and sovereignty as being the underpinning basis of any peace. So I think the mere fact that the summit happened was important, almost more important than the substance of what was discussed.
And my last question for you: do you really believe that negotiations will ever take place in Ukraine? Do you believe that Russia is capable of meaningful negotiations?
I mean, this is at the heart of the challenge that has existed throughout this war. How does it end? It is very difficult because Russia historically is not an easy nation to negotiate with. And President Putin is, as an individual, is certainly not an easy individual to negotiate with. They don't negotiate in good faith historically. They have, and so any peace negotiation would be very challenging from that point of view. Now, that is not to say it is not possible to have some kind of negotiation, but it's going to need very significant international support. It's probably going to need the backing of China, I would imagine, who are probably the one country who can bring real diplomatic pressure onto Moscow. But critically, it's inconceivable that there could be a negotiation with the battlefield sitting as it is. President Zelensky very reasonably doesn't countenance any negotiations while Russia remains on Ukrainian soil, dating back to the 2014 boundaries. Whether downstream he can achieve those objectives, only time will tell. But the one thing that is absolutely certain is that the West and Ukraine, its international supporters, could only countenance ceasefire negotiations when Ukraine is in a position of strength, when it is holding as many cards on the battlefield as possible. You don't negotiate from a position of weakness. So 2024 is not, absolutely not, the year for negotiating some kind of peace plan. Ukraine has to retake the initiative on the battlefield through the back end of this year and into 2025, and stack the cards in its favor as strongly as possible. And then some kind of negotiated settlement might become possible. Critical to that will likely need to be something whereby President Putin can secure some narrative. So it can't be a humiliating defeat for President Putin. That simply isn't going to work with Russia. He's got to, in international parlance, got to give President Putin some kind of off ramp so he can back off with some face saved.
Thank you, General Jones, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Героям слава.